A man jumped out of a moving plane 10,000 feet above the ground with $200,000 strapped to his body, and he was never seen again. For 54 years, nobody knew his real name. Police could not find him. The FBI could not find him. Thousands of tips came in, and every single one led nowhere. But now, a group of family members and one stubborn amateur investigator say they finally know who he was. And the strange part is, the answer might have been sitting quietly inside a family shed the whole time. This is the story of D.B. Cooper and the man who may finally have ended one of the biggest mysteries in American history. Let's go back to where it all started, because you need to understand how wild this story really is. It was the day before Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971. A man walked up to a ticket counter at Portland International Airport and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle under the name Dan Cooper. He looked completely normal, middle-aged, dark suit, black tie, sunglasses, a raincoat folded over his arm. Nobody looked at him twice. He boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305, a Boeing 727, and took a seat near the back of the plane. It was supposed to be a short 30-minute hop. Nothing special, just another business flight before the holiday. Once the plane was in the air, the man calmly waved down a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner and handed her a folded note. She assumed it was some guy trying to flirt with her, so she just slipped it into her pocket without opening it. That's when he leaned toward her and said quietly, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." She opened it right there. The note said he was carrying a bomb in his briefcase, and he wanted her to sit next to him. She sat down, and he opened the briefcase just enough for her to see wires connected to red sticks and a battery. It looked exactly like a bomb. Whether it was real or not, nobody could ever prove, but nobody wanted to test it either. He calmly told her his demands: $200,000 in used $20 bills, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting on the runway when they landed in Seattle. If his demands weren't met, he said, the plane would go down with everyone on it. The flight attendant passed the message to the cockpit. The pilot radioed air traffic control, and within minutes, the news reached the FBI, the airline's headquarters, and even the White House. This was no longer a routine flight. It was now the middle of a live hijacking, and everyone on the ground had only a couple of hours to figure out what to do. The plane circled Seattle for hours while the airline scrambled to get the exact amount of cash together and find 4 parachutes. Passengers on board had no idea what was going on. They just knew the flight was taking longer than expected. Eventually, the plane landed and law enforcement delivered the money and the parachutes to the aircraft. Cooper let all the passengers and most of the crew leave the plane. He kept only the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant on board. Then he ordered the plane to take off again, this time flying toward Mexico City, but slow and low, under 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down and the flaps partly open. It was an unusual way to fly a commercial jet, almost like he had done his homework on exactly how a 727 needed to be set up for what he was about to do. Somewhere over the thick forests of southwest Washington state, in the middle of a rainstorm with freezing winds outside, Cooper lowered the rear staircase of the jet, the same kind of stairs you'd use to walk down onto the tarmac. Except this time, it was open in mid-flight. Around 8 o'clock that night, he stepped out into the darkness with the money strapped to him and vanished into the storm. The remaining crew felt the plane jolt slightly, a small change in air pressure, and that was it. When they landed the plane in Reno, Nevada, Cooper was gone. He'd left behind his black clip-on tie, a few cigarette butts, and nothing else. By the next morning, one of the largest manhunts in American history was underway. FBI agents, Army units, local police, sniffer dogs, and search planes all combed through the forest below where he was believed to have jumped. They searched for weeks. They found nothing. Not a scrap of parachute fabric, not a footprint, not a single clue. It was like he had disappeared into thin air. Investigators tried everything they could think of. They interviewed skydiving instructors to figure out how likely it was that anyone could survive a night jump like that, in freezing rain, into unfamiliar terrain, without any lights to guide him down. Most experts agreed the odds were terrible. The temperature that night was well below freezing at altitude. He jumped wearing only a business suit, loafers, and a thin raincoat. Nothing close to proper gear for a wilderness landing in November. Some investigators believed he never survived the fall at all, and that his body was simply lost somewhere in the dense forest or the freezing rivers below. Others argued that a man who planned this carefully, who knew exactly how to lower a 727's rear stairs mid-flight and how to time his jump around the plane's speed and altitude, probably also knew how to survive what came after. That disagreement never really got resolved, and it's part of why the case became so hard to close. To make things even stranger, the media got his name wrong while reporting the story, and the mistaken name D.B. Cooper stuck forever, even though his actual alias on the ticket was Dan Cooper. The case became instantly famous. Songs were written about him. People treated him almost like a folk hero, a regular guy who beat the system and got away clean. Investigators chased down more than 1,000 suspects over the years. Nothing stuck. DNA samples from the tie he left behind didn't match anyone. Handwriting experts studied his notes over and over. One man even confessed on his deathbed just to get attention, and it turned out to be a lie. The trail had gone completely cold. Then, 9 years later, in February 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sand along the Columbia River during a family camping trip. He found 3 decayed bundles of $20 bills, still held together with rubber bands. The FBI checked the serial numbers, and they matched Cooper's ransom money exactly. This was the only physical evidence ever found connected to the case. It reopened old questions. Did the money wash downstream because Cooper died in the jump? Or did someone plant it there deliberately? Divers searched the river. Forensic teams studied the cache. In the end, they still had nothing solid, no parachute, no remains, no answers. The case stayed technically open for decades, filed as active but dormant, until 2016, when the FBI finally announced they were closing it for good. 45 years of dead ends were enough. It became one of the only unsolved hijackings in United States history, a mystery that seemed destined to stay unsolved forever. Even after the FBI walked away, ordinary people never really did. Amateur researchers kept trading theories online for years. Some believed Cooper was a disgruntled Boeing employee who knew the 727 inside and out. Others were convinced he was a former paratrooper who had simply gotten lucky. A few even thought he might have had help on the ground, someone waiting in the forest with a car and dry clothes. None of these theories ever had real proof behind them. They were just guesses stacked on top of other guesses, kept alive by a case that refused to give anyone a clean answer. But one man refused to let it go. His name is Dan Grider, a retired airline captain with tens of thousands of flight hours who runs a popular aviation YouTube channel. Grider had spent years quietly digging through old FBI files, flight logs, wind patterns, and parachute designs, trying to work out exactly how someone could have survived a jump like that, and where they might have landed. He wasn't doing it for views. He genuinely wanted to solve it. His path eventually led him to a name that had floated around Cooper theories for decades but never fully stuck: Richard Floyd McCoy II. In 2023, Grider was given access to a shed on a family property in North Carolina that had belonged to the McCoy family. Inside, tucked away and mostly forgotten, he found an old military-style parachute rig with strange custom modifications. When he compared it against details from the original 1971 FBI case files, the match was too close to ignore. Unusual harness clips, reinforced cord loops, modifications that only someone with serious skydiving knowledge would even think to make. Grider later described finding it as being like finding one in a billion. Grider didn't just stumble onto the parachute by luck. He had spent years studying old case documents most casual researchers never even knew existed, cross-referencing wind data, terrain maps, and the specific model of parachute rigs issued to skydivers in the early 1970s. He rebuilt possible jump paths using the plane's known speed and heading, trying to narrow down where a jumper could realistically have landed. That kind of obsessive, detailed work is what eventually pointed him toward the McCoy family in the first place, long before he ever laid eyes on the parachute itself. That discovery mattered so much because 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, in April 1972, Richard McCoy pulled off an almost identical crime. On paper, McCoy did not look like the kind of person you'd expect to hijack a plane. He was a Vietnam veteran and helicopter pilot, a devoted family man, a Mormon, and at the time, he was working toward a law degree. His neighbors described him as calm, polite, and deeply religious. He also happened to be an experienced skydiving instructor who had made hundreds of jumps and could probably pack a parachute with his eyes closed. On April 7, 1972, McCoy boarded United Airlines Flight 855 out of Denver. He handed a flight attendant a note saying he had a bomb. He asked for $500,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. Once he had the money, he ordered the pilots back into the air, and somewhere over Utah, he jumped from the plane with the parachute strapped to his chest, just like Cooper had done 5 months earlier. This time, though, he made mistakes. He left a handwritten note behind in the cockpit, and his fingerprints turned up on a drinking glass from the flight. The FBI matched the prints within days and arrested him at his home in Utah, where he was found relaxing with his family as if nothing had happened. Investigators noticed the eerie similarities right away. Same type of aircraft, same rear staircase escape, same calm, quiet demeanor. Even some of the wording in the ransom notes felt oddly similar. Naturally, people asked the obvious question: was McCoy just copying Cooper's playbook, or was he Cooper all along? Officially, the FBI ruled McCoy out. Witnesses on Flight 305 described Cooper as being in his mid-40s, with darker features and olive-toned skin. McCoy was 29 at the time, fair-skinned and clean-cut. The handwriting in the notes didn't match perfectly either. Based on those differences, investigators filed McCoy away as a copycat rather than the original hijacker and moved on. But here's the thing. People started pointing out later, someone who had trained in the military, who understood tactics, timing, and disguise, would know exactly how to change their appearance for a second job. A different hairstyle, a little makeup, a different tone of voice. Even deliberately altering his handwriting wouldn't have been difficult for someone trying to stay one step ahead of investigators. Looking different the second time around wouldn't rule him out. It might actually be exactly what a smart criminal would do on purpose. McCoy was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in prison. 2 years into his sentence, he and a group of other inmates broke out of a Pennsylvania penitentiary by hiding in a garbage truck. He stayed on the run for about 3 months before U.S. Marshals tracked him down in Virginia. When they tried to arrest him, a gunfight broke out and McCoy was killed in 1974. He was only 29 years old. Whatever secrets he was carrying, he took most of them with him that day. It's worth sitting with that for a second. If McCoy really was Cooper, then the answer to one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in the country died in a shootout in a quiet Virginia neighborhood. Just 2.5 years after it began, and almost nobody realized it at the time. The FBI had their man in custody for the second hijacking, sentenced him, and moved on without ever seriously connecting him to the first. If that connection is real, it means investigators had the answer, sitting in a federal prison cell the entire time, and let it slip away. For decades afterward, his children, Shante and Rick McCoy III, grew up under the shadow of rumors that their father might have been the most wanted hijacker in American history. They never talked about it publicly. Part of the reason, they later explained, was that they wanted to protect their mother, Karen, who they believed may have known more than she ever let on, or possibly even helped him in some way. Speaking up while she was alive could have put her at risk of being implicated in a federal crime, so the family simply stayed quiet, year after year, letting the world keep guessing. That changed after their mother passed away. With both parents gone, the siblings finally felt they could speak without putting anyone else in danger. It was around this time that Grider's parachute discovery gave them the final push they needed. He didn't approach them with accusations. He simply told them the evidence was piling up, and that hiding it any longer wasn't going to change what was true. Eventually, they agreed to talk. What came out of those conversations shocked a lot of people. Rick McCoy III admitted that he and his sister had suspected the truth for years. "We never wanted to believe it," he said. "But the more we looked at everything, it's all there. He was Cooper. He had to be. Yeah, we always kind of knew it was him." For two people who had carried that secret their whole lives, saying it out loud in public was a massive moment. Once Grider posted his findings online, the story exploded. Millions of people watched his videos within days. Major news outlets picked it up, and this time, the FBI couldn't ignore it. Grider had already handed the parachute, a harness, and even McCoy's old skydiving logbook over to federal agents in 2023. And the discovery reportedly showed jumps recorded in the same rugged stretches of Oregon and Utah connected to both hijackings. With this new attention, investigators reportedly considered exhuming McCoy's body to get a usable DNA sample, something that could be compared against the partial DNA the FBI had pulled decades earlier from the tie Cooper left behind on the plane. The idea was simple. If McCoy's DNA matched the tie, the mystery would finally be solved for real, with actual scientific proof instead of just a strong theory. For a while, it looked like this could actually happen. The tie had been sitting in FBI storage since 1971, and modern DNA testing is far more advanced than anything available back when the case was still active. Forensic labs today can sometimes pull usable genetic material from decades-old fabric, especially skin cells and sweat trapped in the fibers. Comparing that sample against a living relative or against McCoy's exhumed remains could theoretically settle the question once and for all. It's the kind of forensic breakthrough that has cracked other cold cases that sat unsolved for just as long. Now, here's where the story gets even more interesting, because this isn't a neat, tidy ending. As of the most recent reporting, the FBI has not confirmed that Richard McCoy was D.B. Cooper. In fact, in December 2025, the FBI quietly returned the parachute to the McCoy family without any real explanation, which some retired agents have said usually means the forensic testing came back inconclusive rather than confirming a match. The family, along with Grider, has continued speaking publicly about the case, including a presentation in early 2026, and they still believe the evidence points directly at Richard McCoy. But officially, the case remains open to interpretation. There has been no confirmed DNA match released to the public, and the FBI has not reopened the file as a solved case. So where does that leave us? On one side, you have a matching parachute with rare, unusual modifications. You have a skydiving logbook placing McCoy in the exact same wilderness areas where both jumps happened. You have two hijackings, 5 months apart, that mirror each other almost move for move. And now you have his own children saying out loud that they believe their father did it. That's a lot of pieces lining up in the same direction. Think about how unusual it is for grown children to come forward like this in the first place. There's no financial reward for solving a 50-year-old case. There's no reward money left to claim, no book deal that fixes the FBI's failures. Nothing to gain except public attention on a story most families would probably rather keep buried. If anything, coming forward opens them up to criticism. Strangers picking apart their father's memory online, and a permanent link between their family name and one of the most talked about crimes in the country. The fact that they did it anyway, after staying silent for most of their lives, is part of why so many people find their statement believable. On the other side, the physical evidence still hasn't produced a confirmed scientific match, at least not one the public has seen. The FBI, an agency that spent 45 years chasing this case before closing it, has not officially said the mystery is solved. Handwriting differences, physical description differences, and the quiet return of the parachute all leave room for doubt. There's also the simple fact that the FBI has been fooled before by evidence that looked convincing on the surface. Over the decades, agents chased down bite marks, boot prints, torn fabric, even a rumored dying confession, and every single one of them turned into a dead end. A matching parachute is a strong lead, probably the strongest physical lead the case has ever produced outside of the money found on the riverbank. But a strong lead is still not the same thing as confirmed proof, and the FBI, after everything they've been through with this file, is clearly not willing to say the case is closed again without something harder to point to. Maybe that's honestly what makes this story so gripping. For over 50 years, D.B. Cooper wasn't just a criminal, he became a kind of American legend. A guy who beat the system, jumped into a storm with a bag of cash, and simply vanished. People wrote songs about him. Towns held festivals in his honor. He became bigger than the actual crime itself. And now, maybe, just maybe, that legend has a real face behind it. Not a ghost, not a criminal mastermind who disappeared without a trace. Just a war veteran, a father, a church-going man with a law degree in progress, who might have decided one day that he wanted more than the life he already had. If Richard McCoy really was the man in seat 18C that stormy night in 1971, then the biggest unsolved mystery in American aviation history wasn't solved by the FBI or by forensic science or by decades of federal investigation. It was solved by a retired pilot with a YouTube channel, a dusty parachute in a family shed, and 2 grown children who finally felt safe enough to tell the truth about their father. Whether the FBI ever confirms it officially or not, this case has already changed. What was once a cold, closed file is now back in the spotlight, with new evidence, new witnesses, and a family finally willing to talk. Somewhere between the shocking parachute discovery, the inconclusive test results, and a confession that took over 50 years to come out, the truth about D.B. Cooper feels closer than it has ever been. But until there's a confirmed DNA match on record, the full and final answer is still, technically, up in the air. It's strange to think that a story this big, one that spawned documentaries, books, conspiracy forums, and even a small-town festival held in Cooper's honor every year, might come down to a dusty piece of canvas found in a shed on a quiet family property. No car chase, no dramatic arrest, just a retired pilot with a hobby, a family finally ready to stop protecting a secret, and one old parachute that refused to stay hidden forever. If Dan Greider and the McCoy family are right, then the most famous unsolved hijacking in American history wasn't cracked by a task force or a forensic lab. It was cracked by patience, curiosity, and 2 adult children who finally decided their father's story was more important than the silence they'd kept for decades. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in all of this. Sometimes the biggest mysteries don't get solved with dramatic breakthroughs or high-tech gadgets. Sometimes they just sit quietly for 50 years, waiting for the right person to ask the right question or for the right family to finally feel safe enough to answer it. What do you think? Do you believe Richard McCoy really was D.B. Cooper? Or is this just the closest anyone has ever gotten to the truth without actually reaching it? Let me know what you think in the comments below.